Muscle cars are supposed to be loud, fast, and powerful, but some end up being slow, weird, and completely pointless. From underpowered engines to baffling design choices, these so-called muscle machines make you wonder, what were they thinking? Number 12, 1982 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. The 1982 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am was supposed to be a cool, futuristic muscle car. Instead, it turned out to be one of the dumbest ideas GM ever put on the road. Sure, it looked fast, but the moment you drove one, reality hit like a brick wall. Let's start with the engine, because, muscle cars are supposed to have power. Well, this one didn't. Trans Am buyers had two options: a 145 horsepower V8 with a carburetor, or, if they wanted to splurge, a 165 horsepower version with crossfire fuel injection. That's it, a muscle car with less power than some family sedans. It was so slow that even economy cars were giving it a hard time at stoplights. Then GM thought, hey, let's make it smaller and lighter. They chopped the wheelbase to 101 inches and shaved off 500 pounds. Now, you might think this would make it easier to handle. Nope, instead it just made the car look goofy and cramped. The nose was ridiculously low, like it was sniffing the pavement, and the front grille had these awkward little air slots that made no sense. It looked less like a muscle car and more like a rejected spaceship design. And those pop-up headlights? Absolute garbage. They weren't stylish. They were weird, clunky, and slow to open. Sometimes they didn't even work properly. Inside, things got even worse. GM redesigned the console and dashboard, but instead of feeling modern, it just felt awkward and cheap. They even threw in optional Recaro bucket seats to make it seem sporty, which made the already cramped interior feel even smaller. And that black paint with gold accents? It worked on older Trans Ams, but on this one, it just looked outdated, like an old man trying too hard to look cool. Then we get to the wheels. GM gave it these weird flared openings and turbo-cast wheels, thinking it would look aggressive. Instead, it looked like it was wearing cheap plastic fender flares from a bargain bin. Sure, the car had a drag coefficient of 0.32, meaning it was aerodynamic, but when the car looks this ridiculous, who cares? At the end of the day, the Firebird Trans Am was a muscle car that forgot to be a muscle car. Slow, weird-looking, and poorly thought out. It was proof that even big car companies can have dumb ideas. Number 11, 1969, Ford Mercury Cyclone, Spoiler 2. The 1969 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2 is one of the most confusing muscle cars ever made. It was supposed to be a high-speed, race-inspired machine, but it was slow, impractical, and barely made sense on the street. Mercury designed it for NASCAR's Aero Wars, giving it a longer, sleeker front end by stretching the nose about 6 inches. They even reshaped the rocker panels, so race versions could sit 1 inch lower. Sounds fast, right? Wrong. The street version came with a 351 cubic inch Windsor V8 engine, making 290 horsepower. Still, it had an automatic transmission and a bench seat, not exactly race-ready. The result, a muscle car that looked fast but felt slow. Mercury released it in 2 flashy paint schemes, named after Dan Gurney and Cale Yarborough, to make things even stranger. These schemes featured bright colors like presidential blue and candy apple red. They built between 300 and 500 units, making it feel like a pointless marketing stunt rather than an actual muscle car. It had all the style of a race car, but none of the speed to back it up. I hope you enjoy this video. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Number 10, 1966, Chevelle SS 396. The 1966 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396 was a muscle car that could not decide what it wanted to be. It had immense power, but Chevrolet loaded it with random luxury features that made no sense in a high-performance machine. On the outside, it looked aggressive, with wide front grills, curvy fenders, and a strong stance. But stepped inside, and things got weird. Chevrolet gave it 4-way power seats, cruise control, and even a built-in tissue dispenser. A tissue dispenser in a muscle car! Under the hood, things seemed more promising. The 396 cubic inch V8 engine came in 3 versions: 325, 360, and 375 horsepower. The fastest version could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 5.4 seconds and hit a top speed of 118 miles per hour. Impressive, but that did not change the fact that it was a confused car. part muscle, part luxury, and not fully committed to either. Above all, Chevrolet tried to blend brute force with comfort, but instead, they made a car that did not fully satisfy anyone. It was neither a pure muscle car nor a true luxury car. Just a strange mix that made no sense. Number 9, 1982, Chevrolet Camaro Iron Duke. Some cars are legendary, some are unforgettable. And then there's the 1982 Chevrolet Camaro Iron Duke, a muscle car so badly designed it's like Chevy wasn't even trying. This was supposed to be a Camaro, a name that stood for speed and power. Instead, they gave it an engine so weak, it should have come with a "Do Not Pass Bicycles" sign. Let's talk about that joke of an engine. The Iron Duke was a 153 cubic inch, 4-cylinder lump producing a whopping 90 horsepower. There was a time when 90 horsepower was a lot. That time was 1932, but by the early 80s, it was embarrassing. Even worse, it came with a 3-speed automatic transmission, meaning acceleration was so bad that 0 to 60 miles per hour took around 20 seconds. Imagine flooring the gas pedal and watching school buses zoom past you. It was that slow. And yet Chevy had the nerve to market this as a Camaro. A Camaro, the same car that once roared with big V8s, now wheezed along with a 4-cylinder that sounded like a dying lawnmower. It had the looks of a muscle car, but none of the muscle. Sure, Chevy built this thing because of the gas crisis, but let's be real. This was just a bad idea. It didn't feel sporty, it wasn't fun, and it made Camaro fans cry themselves to sleep. Luckily, Chevy realized their mistake and fixed things later, but the Iron Duke will always be remembered as the Camaro that should never have existed. Number 8, 1963, Ford Galaxie Lightweight. In 1963, Ford made a car that barely qualified as a car. The Ford Galaxie Lightweight was a stripped-down, cut-apart, bare-bones machine built only for the drag strip. It had no comfort, no style, and barely any practicality. Just an engine stuffed into a frame with as little weight as possible. Under the hood sat a massive 427 cubic inch V8 engine with dual 4-barrel carburetors, pushing out 425 horsepower. Sounds powerful, right? But Ford removed nearly everything else to make it lighter. Instead of normal steel body panels, this Galaxie had fiberglass fenders, a hood, and a trunk lid. The front and rear bumpers were made of thin aluminum, which offered about as much protection as a soda can. Inside, Ford went to extreme lengths. No radio, no clock, no armrests, no insulation, no backup lights, and even the roof support was removed. The seats were cheap, lightweight buckets, and the floor was covered in rubber mats instead of carpet. Additionally, it had a T10 4-speed transmission and a 4.11 ratio 1 rear axle, built strictly for straight-line speed. But outside of the drag strip, it was useless. No power steering, no comfort, no practicality, just an overpowered engine in a half-finished car. Ford built 200 of these, proving that even muscle cars could sometimes go too far in the wrong direction. Number 7, 1968-70, Pontiac Tempest. Some muscle cars make history. Others just make you wonder, what were they thinking? That's the 1968-1970 Pontiac Tempest, a car so weirdly designed, so badly thought out, that it managed to be both ugly and underwhelming at the same time. Let's start with the design. Pontiac decided to restyle the Tempest to make it look sleek and modern, but instead, it ended up looking like a Coca-Cola bottle with wheels. Narrow in the middle, bulging out at the sides, and just plain awkward. The 112-inch wheelbase for the two-door models was almost 6 inches shorter than before, but the car got 75 pounds heavier. That's like going on a diet and gaining weight. And then there was the front-end disaster. Pontiac ditched the classic vertically stacked headlights and replaced them with horizontal ones, making the car look older, not newer. Oh, and they also thought adding hidden headlights as an option would be cool, because nothing says muscle car like headlights playing hide and seek. Now, let's pop the hood and immediately close it in disappointment. The 250 cubic inch straight-six engine had no real power boost, so it was just as sluggish as before. You could upgrade to the 350 cubic inch V8, but even that barely made a difference. It was like ordering extra toppings on a bad pizza, still disappointing. And don't even get me started on the rear. The massive bumper stretched across the whole car, swallowing the taillights like some chrome monster. The sides were plain with zero personality, and the entire car just felt like Pontiac wasn't sure what they were doing. In the end, the Tempest tried to be a muscle car but ended up looking like a confused mess. No wonder it disappeared after 2 years. Number 6, 1974, Ford Gran Torino. The 1974 Ford Gran Torino was a car that looked powerful but failed to deliver. It had the size, the styling, and the attitude of a muscle car. But when it came to actual performance, it was slow, heavy, and disappointing. At the heart of the problem was the 452 cubic inch V8 engine. A few years earlier, this engine would have made over 400 horsepower. Still, by 1974, thanks to strict emissions regulations, it was reduced to just 220 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. That might sound decent, but for a car this big, it meant 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.6 seconds, which was far from impressive for a so-called muscle car. Then came the design changes. Government safety rules forced Ford to install massive bumpers that made the car bulkier and heavier. The taillights wrapped around the sides, and Ford tried to be creative by hiding the fuel filler behind a panel on the taillight section. But it did not add any real value. The Gran Torino Brougham version went even further, adding a full-width reflector panel between the taillights and a hood ornament, making it feel more like a luxury cruiser than a true muscle car. In the end, the 1974 Gran Torino was a muscle car in name only. It was big, underpowered, and loaded with unnecessary design changes, making it one of the most disappointing muscle cars of its time. Number 5, 1964, Ford Falcon Sprint 58. The 1963 Ford Falcon Sprint is often mistaken for a real muscle car, but in reality, it was a confused little coupe that never knew what it wanted to be. It had the right look, a 2-door rear-wheel drive setup with a V8 engine up front, but the performance was nowhere near muscle car standards. Under the hood, it had a 260 cubic inch V8 engine, which sounds impressive until you realize it only made 164 horsepower at 4,400 revolutions per minute. The 258 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 revolutions per minute was decent, but the car simply lacked the power to back up its sporty image. It came with a 4-speed manual transmission, which was nice. But shifting through gears did not change the fact that this car was more show than go. Things got even more bizarre when people started modifying it into something it was never meant to be. At one point, this Falcon Sprint was turned into a pro street car with massive 33-inch rear tires, a Ford 302 engine with a performance cam, and a ladder bar rear suspension. The result? A car that looked fast but was completely impractical. Eventually, the modifications were removed and it was rebuilt with a Mustang 2-style front suspension, Willwood disc brakes, and modern wheels. But even with these updates, the Falcon Sprint never escaped its identity crisis. It was too small and underpowered to be a muscle car, too sporty to be a practical coupe, and too awkward to be taken seriously. Number 4, 1974, Pontiac GTO. The 1974 Pontiac GTO is proof that even legends can make terrible decisions. Once the king of muscle cars, the GTO was reduced to something so disappointing that it felt more like a cheap knockoff than the real thing. By this point, Pontiac had completely lost the plot, and the result was a muscle car that had no muscle, no style, and no reason to exist. First, let's talk about what's under the hood, because that's where the real disaster begins. The GTO had a 350 cubic inch V8 engine, which sounds great until you realize it only produced 200 horsepower. That is a joke for a car that once ruled the streets. If you paired it with a 3-speed automatic transmission, you could crawl from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 9.5 seconds. If you picked a manual, it was a painfully slow 7.7 seconds. Either way, it was like racing a refrigerator uphill. Then there was the design problem. Instead of being built on a proper muscle car platform, Pontiac decided to stick the GTO badge on a Chevy Nova clone. That was like slapping a Ferrari logo on a minivan and calling it a day. The so-called shaker hood scoop, one of its signature features, barely even worked. It had a vacuum-operated system that was more of a gimmick than an actual performance upgrade. And the interior? Cramped, boring, and cheap-looking. Whether you went for bucket seats or the console setup, you still felt like you were driving something that belonged in a rental lot, not a showroom. The The color choices were uninspired, and no amount of sporty decals could hide the fact that this car was an embarrassment. Pontiac sold just over 7,000 of these before pulling the plug after one miserable year. That says it all. The 1974 GTO wasn't just bad. It was a muscle car that forgot how to be a muscle car. Number 3, 1972 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. Some cars are confused about their purpose, but the 1972 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS took confusion to a whole new level. Was it a muscle car? Was it a luxury cruiser? Even Chevrolet didn't seem to know, and in the end, they built a car that failed at both. It was a Monte Carlo that wanted to be tough, but ended up as soft as a couch. First, let's talk about the biggest mistake. They killed the SS package. Instead, Chevrolet introduced the Monte Carlo Custom, which sounded fancy but was really just the SS with no commitment. It had some sporty features, but you could pair it with any engine, even the weakest ones. That meant you could have a Monte Carlo that looked fast, but was as slow as a lazy Sunday afternoon. Now, the engines. This is where things get really bad. Because of the new SAE net horsepower ratings, power numbers plummeted. The 348 cubic inch V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor made a pathetic 165 horsepower. The 4-barrel version gave you just 10 more horsepower, barely worth mentioning. The 402 cubic inch engines managed 240 horsepower, and even the biggest 454 cubic inch V8 could only push out 270 horsepower. For a so-called muscle car, these numbers were embarrassing. But wait, it gets worse. The 4-speed manual transmission was completely gone. Instead, you get a boring 3-speed automatic and, if you are unlucky, a 2-speed power glide. Yes, a 2-speed transmission in a muscle car. That is the automotive equivalent of wearing flip-flops to run a marathon. Not only this, the exterior was just as pointless. They swapped out the grille for a Cadillac-style egg crate design, which looked more like a luxury car than a muscle car. The parking lights moved into the grille, trying to look fancy, but ending up awkward. Inside, they cheapened things up. Instead of sporty bucket seats, they gave you a boring vinyl bench seat as standard, because nothing says muscle car like the same seating setup as your dad's station wagon. Ultimately, the 1972 Monte Carlo SS was the most confused muscle car ever made. It wanted to be everything, but ended up being nothing special. It wasn't fast, sporty, luxurious, or memorable, except for being one of the dumbest muscle cars Chevrolet ever made. Number 2, 1970 Ford Ranchero. Ever wanted a muscle car that didn't know if it was a truck or a sports car? No? Well, too bad, because Ford went ahead and made one anyway. The 1970 Ford Ranchero, the most confused vehicle to ever hit the road. This thing tried to be everything at once and failed spectacularly. First, Ford took the Torino body, chopped off the back seats, and slapped on a truck bed because nothing says performance, like a car that hauls mulch. And to make it even dumber, they gave it a 57-degree sloped windshield, so it looked fast even when it was parked next to actual fast cars that could leave it in the dust. The trim levels? Pure nonsense. The Squire had fake wood paneling because who doesn't want their muscle car to look like a station wagon? The GT tried to act tough with bold stripes and a sporty tailgate, as if a tailgate had ever made anything go faster. The Ranchero 500 was a fancier version that still couldn't decide if it was a muscle car or a farm tool. And then there was the base model, which was just a car that gave up halfway through being built. And under the hood, even more chaos. The entry-level models had a weak 6-cylinder engine or a small V8 that didn't live up to its looks. The GT packed a 302 cubic inch V8 with 220 horsepower, which wasn't bad, but also wasn't unique. Then came the ridiculous options: 351 cubic inches with 300 horsepower, or the massive 429 V8 making 370 horsepower. Sounds powerful, right? It's too bad the Ranchero was too heavy and awkward to use it well. In addition, Ford even gave it a shaker hood scoop, locking hood pins and sporty badges, as if that would convince anyone this thing belonged at a drag strip. In reality, the Ranchero was just a pickup that dressed up like a muscle car for Halloween. It wasn't fast enough to race, wasn't practical enough to be a truck, and had no idea what it wanted to be. The 1970 Ford Ranchero happens when someone at Ford asks, what if a muscle car and a pickup had a really bad idea for a baby? And the answer? It's one of the stupidest muscle cars ever made. Number 1, 1969, Chevrolet Corvette Stingray 427. Some cars are fast, some vehicles are wild, and some cars are just plain stupid. The 1969 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray 427 falls squarely into that last category. It was a muscle car with a brain the size of a peanut, insanely powerful but completely useless in the real world. Let's start with the only thing this car had going for it: a monstrous 427 cubic inch V8. It came in 3 ridiculous versions, making 390, 400, or an absurd 435 horsepower. And the top version? It had triple 2-barrel carburetors, solid lifters, and aluminum heads. Basically, it was a race car pretending to be street legal. But guess what? All that power was utterly wasted. Beyond this, Chevrolet gave the Corvette all this muscle, but forgot to provide decent tires. The result? It couldn't put any of that power to the pavement. Road and Track tested it and found that if it had better tires, it could have been a full second faster in the quarter mile. That means this car lost races, but it should have won just because of bad tires. And what kind of muscle car fails at being fast? Then there's the 0 to 60 miles per hour time, 6 seconds. Not bad, right? Except this thing had a 4-speed manual transmission and a crazy 4.11 rear axle ratio, which means it was revving its lungs out just to stay moving. It did the quarter mile in 14.3 seconds at 98 miles per hour, which sounds good until you remember that some cheaper muscle cars could keep up without all the drama. And let's not forget the worst part. Only 2,722 of the top engines were built. Why? Because even back in 1969, people knew this car was ridiculous. It was like strapping a rocket to a roller skate. Dangerous, unstable, and not as fast as it should have been. The 1969 Corvette Stingray 427 proved that too much power and not enough sense makes for one of the stupidest muscle cars ever built. Which other muscle cars deserve a spot on the stupidest cars list? Let us know in the comments below.
When it comes to muscle cars, we think of sleek lines, roaring engines, and powerful performance. But then, some AMC muscle cars took bold to a whole new level with designs that were completely cringe and ugly. Join us in this video as we discuss 12 of the ugliest AMC muscle cars in history. Number 12, the 1971 AMC Matador. The AMC Matador sounds like a car you'd expect to take on anything. But looking at the 1971 Matador's front end, you'll wonder if you're being pranked. Let's be honest, this car looked like it was grinning at you, and not a confident, "I'm about to smoke you" kind of grin. No, this is more like the awkward smile you give in a family photo when you don't really want to be there. Why did it look this way? Its oversized grille feature. It was as if AMC couldn't decide between giving it a standard grille or making it the car's primary feature. So they went with both. The result was a toothy look that's impossible to unsee, making it hard to take the Matador seriously as a muscle car. Under the hood, it had a 304 cubic inch V8 engine. Despite its engine, the Matador wasn't as powerful or agile as its competitors. It was more of a lumbering giant than a fierce contender, offering just enough power to get by, but not enough to impress anyone. In all fairness, the Matador tried to be different. Maybe that's why people still remember it, even if not for the reasons AMC intended. Think of it as that family member who shows up at Thanksgiving in an outfit from the 70s that everyone else has long since left behind. Sure, it's weird, but you kind of love them for the effort. Number 11, the 1974 AMC Matador Coupe. If the 1971 Matador had an identity crisis with its oversized grille, the 1974 AMC Matador Coupe was AMC's way of doubling down on design oddities. This time, AMC went all out with curves, giving the car an almost futuristic look. At least that was the intention. What they ended up with, however, was a vehicle that looked like it couldn't decide if it was a spaceship or a muscle car. With its rounded, bulging body, the 1974 Matador Coupe was unique, to say the least. Rather than sleek, it came across as bloated, almost puffy, which was nothing like the muscle car design most had fallen in love with. Now, if you can get past the styling, you might think, Hey, at least it must have power, right? Well, not quite. While the Matador Coupe did offer a V8 option, the car's weight made it more of a cruiser than a sprinter. Acceleration wasn't as sharp as other muscle cars of the era, and handling was nothing to brag about either. It could move, sure, but it didn't exactly take corners with grace. This car wanted to look like a beast, but when it came to performance, it was more bark than bite. Some car lovers argue that AMC was trying to go European with the Matador Coupe, chasing a sleeker, more sophisticated style. But let's be real, this was no Aston Martin. It ended up looking like a fish out of water, a mix of almost elegant and confusingly bulky. If cars could talk, this one might say, "Hey, I tried all right." And maybe that's what makes it manageable, in a "we'll laugh about this later" kind of way. Number 10. The 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. The AMC Rebel Machine was supposed to be AMC's bold declaration of American muscle, and boy did they commit. Painted in a red, white, and blue scheme that could be seen from miles away, it was like a giant rolling 4th of July parade on wheels. AMC wanted this car to be the poster child for patriotism, and it did, maybe a little too loudly. The styling was meant to be eye-catching, and it certainly was, but it came off as tacky. It's as if someone went overboard with the concept of stars and stripes. The Rebel Machine practically wore a flag on its hood, which would have been cool if it didn't look like someone's DIY weekend project. And that big hood scoop? Yeah, it was functional, but it also looked like a giant nose breathing heavily down the road. This car wasn't here to make friends. It was here to let everyone know AMC wasn't backing down, even if it meant being a little loud and proud about it. But what about the power? AMC wasn't entirely off the mark with this one. The Rebel Machine packed a 340 horsepower 390 V8 engine, which meant it had some serious muscle under that overly patriotic paint job. The car could go fast, but that speed came with a few caveats. Handling was stiff, to put it mildly, and the ride was rough. It didn't glide down the road so much as it stomped, making sure you felt every bump and groove along the way. It was built to be bold, not refined, and driving it meant embracing a ride that was as loud as its color scheme. The Rebel Machine is like that loud uncle at the family BBQ who insists on wearing red, white, and blue from head to toe. You appreciate his enthusiasm, even if he's a bit over the top. Number 9. The 1975 AMC Pacer X. If there was ever a car that made you wonder, what were they thinking? It's this one. Nicknamed the fishbowl on wheels, the Pacer X has a look that's hard to forget, and not necessarily in a good way. Imagine taking a regular car and blowing it up like a balloon until it's uncomfortably round, with glass everywhere. You could practically see from one side to the other, thanks to the massive windows. It was like AMC wanted to give drivers an immersive, panoramic experience. Only problem? It looked like an aquarium on wheels. The round, bulbous design made the car feel oddly spacious, yet entirely out of place. There was nothing subtle about the Pacer's look. It practically screamed, "Look at me! No, really, look at all of me!" But as strange as it was, that design choice didn't do much for the car's performance. The Pacer X came with a 6-cylinder engine that offered about as much thrill as a lawnmower. Sure, you could get it moving, but it wasn't going to win any races. It had the body of a jelly bean, but the heart of a commuter car, making its place in the muscle car world somewhat questionable. If anything, it was more suited for leisurely grocery runs than tearing down the highway. Despite its awkward looks and uninspiring power, the Pacer X somehow found its way into pop culture as the ugly car everyone kind of loved. Maybe it was Wayne and Garth rocking out to Queen in Wayne's World, or maybe it's the fact that it's just so strange that it's impossible to forget. Like that weird friend who shows up to every gathering with some bizarre new outfit, the Pacer X made an impression, even if it left people scratching their heads. Number 8. The 1968 AMC Javelin SST. The 1968 AMC Javelin SST was AMC's attempt to jump into the high-stakes muscle car market with big dogs like the Ford Mustang and Chevrolet Camaro. And while AMC got a few things right, the Javelin SST ended up being more of an almost than an all-star. Sure, it had a muscular silhouette, But there was something off about it. It's like AMC was trying to create a sturdy hero, but ended up with a supporting character instead. The Javelin SST's front end, in particular, was unconventional. The grille looked a little pinched, almost like it was sucking in its cheeks for a photo. And let's talk about those rear seats. They were cramped and oddly angled as if they'd been squeezed in to check a box. For a car that was supposed to make you feel powerful and comfortable, the interior made you feel, well, a little claustrophobic. Under the hood, the Javelin SST had some bite. With a 343 cubic inch V8 option, it could put up decent numbers. But once you hit a curve, things got dicey. The handling was heavy, and the car had a knack for feeling unsteady at higher speeds, like it couldn't quite keep up with its ambition. The Javelin SST is a classic case of almost. You can see what AMC was going for, and you kind of want to root for it. It's the muscle car that showed up to the drag race, trying to play with the big boys, but ended up watching from the sidelines. Number 7, the 1979 AMC Spirit AMX. In 1979, AMC decided to throw a curveball by creating a hot hatch version of the classic AMX. The result was the AMC Spirit AMX, a car that looked like it skipped muscle car boot camp entirely. Instead of the wide, aggressive stance you'd expect, the Spirit AMX had a stubby, boxy look. Imagine taking a muscle car and shrinking it down until it looked like a hatchback trying to flex. The Spirit AMX just couldn't pull off that tough guy vibe, no matter how hard it tried. The design had all the grit of a hatchback and none of the swagger of a muscle car. The proportions were all wrong, making it look like a car that missed leg day at the gym. When it came to performance, the Spirit AMX didn't do much to live up to its namesake. The 4-cylinder engine option felt woefully underpowered for anything with the AMX label. Yes, it was lighter and quicker than other AMCs of the era, but that's not saying much. For a muscle car, it was more of a puppy than a bulldog, managing to be fast without delivering any real muscle. It's like calling a house cat a jungle cat. It was definitely not what people were expecting. The Spirit AMX was the car equivalent of a Chihuahua wearing a spiked collar, trying so hard to look tough, but just a bit too small to pull it off. And yet, that's kind of what makes it unique. The Spirit AMX tried to be different, and even if it didn't nail the muscle car look, it's hard not to appreciate its strange ambition. Number 6, the 1977 AMC Hornet AMX. The 1977 AMC Hornet AMX was AMC's attempt to merge the Hornet, a practical, boxy compact, with the legendary AMX muscle vibe. The result? A car that looked more like it was ready for a high school parking lot than a drag strip. With its squat shape, the Hornet AMX didn't exactly exude muscle. The lines were sharp but not aggressive, and the whole design lacked the punch you'd expect from something with an AMX badge. The front end looked hesitant, almost as if the car itself wasn't sure it could pull off the look. It's like AMC took the AMX identity, washed it in cold water, and ended up with a skinny, softer version of its former self. And then there was the engine. Sure, it had a V8 option, but at best it delivered a mediocre performance. Instead of roaring down the street, it hummed along like it was more comfortable with errands than races. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but when something's branded as an AMX, you expect a little more bite. The Hornet AMX wasn't slow, but it certainly wasn't fast enough to justify the AMX badge. Number 5, the 1968 AMC AMX. The 1968 AMC AMX was AMC's first true two-seater muscle car, and it had the right idea. Take the Javelin, remove the back seats, and crank up the strength. It sounds good in theory, but somehow the AMX ended up looking like the muscle car equivalent of a stretch limo. Its proportions felt slightly off, with a nose that went on and a cabin that seemed like an afterthought. It was a bit like AMC couldn't decide between a sports car and a muscle car, so they just threw everything together and hoped for the best. The elongated hood was AMC's way of saying, "Look at this power," but the stretched out effect left the car looking strange, as if it were trying to impersonate a jet without wings. And while the front had a kind of rugged charm, the rear end felt squished, almost like AMC ran out of metal by the time they got there. It's a car that starts off serious in the front, only to lose interest halfway through. Underneath that extended hood, however, the AMX actually delivered on the performance front. It came with a beefy 390 V8 option that packed a punch, proving that it could keep up with its rivals on the road, if not in the looks department. The AMX was fast, no doubt about that, but its handling could be a bit tricky. It felt as if the car's elongated design worked against it, making it a bit of a handful to control. The 1968 AMX is like a superhero in an ill-fitting costume. It has the power and the intent, but the look doesn't quite match the character. It's the kind of car you want to root for because, despite its flaws, it tried to be bold. Sure, it might look like the muscle car equivalent of a giraffe, but it had heart, and that counts for something. Number 4, the 1980 AMC Eagle SX4. If there was ever a muscle car that couldn't make up its mind, it was the 1980 AMC Eagle SX4. AMC had a wild idea. Let's create a rugged four-wheel drive car that also has muscle car ambitions. Sounds interesting, right? But the result was a vehicle that seemed to be having a bit of an identity crisis. It looked like it was caught between an off-road warrior and city cruiser, leaving it stranded somewhere in the middle without really excelling at either. The Eagle SX4 was almost laughably heavy for its size, which didn't do its performance any favors. It sat high off the ground, looking ready to tackle rough terrain, but then the sporty stripes and hood scoop tried to convince you it was a muscle car. It's like AMC dressed this car up in hiking boots and a leather jacket, leaving it confused about whether it should be hitting the trails or the highway. Power-wise, the Eagle SX4 had all the grit of a compact SUV with a modest 258 cubic inch inline-six engine. It could run along well enough, but it wasn't winning any speed records and its handling was clunky. Combine that with a soft suspension designed for off-roading, and the car felt like it was perpetually trying to stabilize itself on an uneven surface. The Eagle SX4 could do a little bit of everything, but not particularly well. In the end, this car is like the jack of all trades who's not really great at any of them. It's got all the gear for an adventure, but none of the power or precision to back it up. The Eagle SX4 is the muscle car that wanted to have it all and ended up with an awkward blend of conflicting features. You can't help but respect its ambition, but it's hard not to chuckle at the execution. Number 3, the 1973 AMC Gremlin X. The AMC Gremlin X is, hands down, one of the strangest cars ever to wear a muscle badge. The Gremlin itself was already a peculiar little model with a stubby, chopped-off rear end that looked more like a practical joke than a serious car design. But then AMC went and slapped an X on it, threw in some racing stripes, and called it sporty. Suddenly, we had the Gremlin X, an oddball of oddballs. The Gremlin X looked like AMC started designing it and then just stopped halfway through. From the front, it almost looked like it could be a tough little car, but take a few steps back and you're faced with that sharp rear end, which looked like it had been chopped off in a moment of panic. For a car trying to look sporty, it had the proportions of a marshmallow that had been hastily trimmed to fit in a lunchbox. The Gremlin X came with a V8 option, which helped it scoot around a bit faster than a standard Gremlin. But let's be real, even with extra power, it wasn't fooling anyone. It was heavy for its size, so acceleration was clumsy, and handling was, well, let's just say it didn't make sharp corners gracefully. The Gremlin X is the AMC muscle car that feels like a prank. It's a vehicle that practically dares you to take it seriously, but then winks at you as if to say, just kidding. It's one of those cars that makes you smile simply because it exists. Sure, it's weird and kind of ridiculous, but that's what gives it its own bizarre charm. Number 2, the 1974 AMC Ambassador. The 1974 AMC Ambassador was AMC's attempt to blend luxury and muscle, but this big, boxy sedan ended up looking more like a dad at a rock concert trying to fit in with the crowd. With its upright, no-nonsense shape, the Ambassador looked like it should be chauffeuring executives, not burning rubber. It was a heavy car with a conservative design, trying desperately to fit in with the fast and furious muscle car lineup. But let's face it, it was about as intimidating as a beige station wagon. AMC equipped the Ambassador with a 401 cubic inch V8 option, and while it could run, the weight of the car held it back from real muscle status. Handling felt more like you were steering a small boat than a car, and despite its power, the Ambassador wasn't exactly agile on its feet. It had the power to go fast but felt reluctant to do so, as if it preferred smooth, leisurely cruises over quick takeoffs and tight turns. The Ambassador was AMC's well-dressed but slightly out-of-place entry into the muscle car game. It's like the guest at a pool party who shows up in a three-piece suit, clearly dressed for something else but determined to make it work. It's hard not to love the Ambassador for trying, though, even if it never quite pulled off the muscle look. Number 1. The 1978 AMC Concord AMX. The 1978 AMC Concord AMX is perhaps the least AMX of all the cars that wore the badge. AMC's original AMX models were two-seaters with attitude, built for the thrill of speed. The Concord AMX, on the other hand, was a squared-off, ultra-conservative box that seemed better suited for grocery runs than drag races. It looked like the kind of car you'd expect to see parked at a PTA meeting, not tearing down the highway. The Concord AMX came with a modest V8, which meant it could run moderately, but there was no roar, no thrill. The performance was about as exciting as the design, a car that seemed to have forgotten what AMX was supposed to stand for. It felt like AMC took the AMX nameplate and slapped it on the Concord as an afterthought, hoping a little AMX magic would transform a mild-mannered compact sedan into a fierce muscle car. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The Concord AMX is the muscle car equivalent of an accountant who suddenly decided to take up extreme sports. You applaud the effort, but you can't help feeling that it's just a bit forced. It was AMC's last-ditch effort to hold on to the AMX name, even if the spirit just wasn't there anymore. AMC may not have been known for producing the most beautiful or fearsome muscle cars, but they definitely created some memorable ones. From the overly patriotic Rebel Machine to the awkwardly squashed Gremlin X, each of these cars had a unique personality that's hard to forget. They may not have been the most successful or the most beautiful, but AMC's muscle cars had a charm all their own. They were underdogs with oddball designs, cars that dared to be different even when that meant risking a little ridicule. What do you think about some of these cars? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe and like it. See you in the next one.